Morning and welcome to this week's Jump Recruitment Discussion. This week, we're looking at what I believe to be the hardest and most influential role in recruitment, the billing manager. We're looking at the transition from big biller to billing managers. This week, we're going to look at what it feels like when we transition across. So when I started to look at stats this week, I started to look at stats that made me feel when I was doing this transition, what I felt like. And it was these sort of things that start to come to mind that sort of pull this sort of, webinar together. So employees who feel their voices are heard 4.6 times are more likely to be empowered to perform at their best. And that came from Forbes. But when I was a manager, I was too busy in the beginning to actually hear what my people were saying. The average company's biggest productivity losses are often caused by less than 20% of their employees who are disengaged or extremely disengaged. And when I first started to management, my style was probably switching more than 20% of my people off because I wasn't tuned into my people. 4 out of 10 workers are actively disengaged and get little or no feedback. Again, I was more focused on what I was doing rather than giving really good and regular feedback back to my staff and what people were there. 92% of respondents, I don't know how many people responded to this because this was a Harvard Business Review, 92% of respondents agreed with the assertion that negative feedback, if delivered appropriately, is effective at improving performance. Where I had a manager who just did negative feedback constantly, but never looked at the positives. And it was really interesting because it was really, I think, where you start to grow is when you look at the negative side and the positive side to work from there. Managers who receive feedback from their staff on their strengths grow by 8.9% and grow their profitability by more. And that came from Gallup. I simply didn't care what my people said because I just thought I knew it all. So it's a really sort of interesting thing that you start to listen to the feedback from your staff.
Nothing's changed, Howard. Nothing's changed.
Correct, Paul. Nothing's changed. Companies adopting continuous performance feedback significantly outperform the competition at a 24% higher rate. So to me, feedback there was only KPIs and not actual personal feedback that would help to drive people. According to 86% of all employees and executives, poor collaboration and ineffective communication is the reason for workplace failure. And collaboration and communication to me was only found in one place when I was a manager or a junior manager, and that was generally in the pub because I was so blinkered about what was going on. I looked at that. Focusing feedback on employees' weaknesses, pure weaknesses, reduce performance by 27%. So we start to think about what we're doing as managers and how the feedback that we give, and therefore when we move from being a big biller into that first manager, how we run. So today I'm joined by Paul. Dave's in an emergency board meeting. Heather has COVID, unfortunately, so she's not with us. We've also been joined by a special guest this week, someone who's recently undertaken the transition from big biller to billing manager, because when Paul and I went through this process, dinosaurs were still roaming the earth. She'll be very open and very honest about the pitfalls of the process, and we can listen to firsthand her experience, whilst Paul and I will add our experiences to that. So let's welcome Kelly Nolan. Kelly runs her own agency now. However, unlike most people, she doesn't want to grow and scale her agency because she doesn't want to manage people. And that's not a problem from our point of view. However, Kelly's one of those gifted recruiters that all businesses want in terms of billings who would sit in their business. She spent 8 years at Rullion and became one of their biggest perm billers before moving to NSC, where she became one of their, again, biggest perm billers. Stayed there for 5 years before striding out by ourselves. So Kelly, welcome. Paul, Kelly, let's drive straight in. I often start to think about this transition, and I think it is definitely one of the hardest transitions that we have in the recruitment marketplace. So if I looked at what you did, Kelly, what do you believe was your biggest challenge when stepping up from being a big biller into that management type of role?
I would probably say a lot of sort of time management and balance in the time of being a biller and managing a team at this, doing both. Really, really difficult thing to do is being a top biller and manage a team and having to train, develop people, win business, manage clients, do, meetings, management meetings, etc. So I would say for me personally, the biggest challenge was time management and time balance.
It's interesting, isn't it, Paul? Sort of time management, time balance. We talk about this an awful lot, certainly in management training, about how to create more time as a manager and give more time back to your staff. So when you went through this process, what did you find that was your biggest sort of challenge?
Well, I think, I get Kelly's point. And actually, when I was thinking about this prior to the webinar, I was going to say exactly the same thing. I think time management becomes one of the ultimate challenges for anybody that's been a big biller, particularly because, big billers, and I think we'll talk about this a bit later on, by sheer nature are utterly obsessed by performance, their own performance, and are literally blinkered often regarding what else is going on around them. That sort of total razor-like focus makes the big billers, and then suddenly you're propelled into a position where you are not only responsible for managing your own desk still, but helping others to develop their skill sets and provide the revenues for the team as a whole. And that, I think, is a really difficult transition for most people to make, particularly for the big billers. I mean, I think a bit later on we'll talk about mindset, because the other point I was about to make, I think, is that when you've been conditioned to perform well on a regular basis in recruitment, your mindset is very, as I said, focused on what you're doing today, excuse me, on a daily basis, how you're making the figures stack up for the week or for the month. And now, as I said, you've got to have a broader understanding of what everybody else is doing around you, which links into Kelly's point about time management. And time management is something that I think most of us we struggle with it, because, to be frank, in recruitment we're dealing with situations which are consistently reactive, and what you've got to do, and this is really one of the biggest challenges, is find time to be proactive. And I think that transition is an incredibly difficult one for billing managers to make.
It's interesting. When I sort of went through that process, I think the biggest sort of challenge that I had was an ego challenge. And that's ego because I was so used to being in charge of my own billing, so in charge of my own destiny, that I was hell bent on proving anybody wrong that said I couldn't do things. And what I didn't want to do was follow suit of my previous managers and do what they had done to me and have that done to others. So I became very sort of blinkered, I think, in my approach, and had a very limited understanding of people. And I think that's sort of the biggest challenge with that limited understanding of people. And I found out quickly what failure actually feels like. And that started to sort of kickstart my change. And so I think when we start to think about the true challenge of moving that, and it's from being a big biller to a billing manager, is that re-education of yourself. Re-education of yourself to understand that it's not about you, it's about influencing others. I think we said last week, at the end of last week's webinar, about managers, that if you talked about what you think the most influential thing you've understood about management, it's not about you, it is all about the others. And I think until we understood that, things hadn't changed. And I think that sort of brings me into that sort of question of, transitioning from one to the other is a really hard situation. So how hard did you find that transition, Kelly, when you went from one to other? Because your story is quite an interesting story when we start to look about why you transitioned and not what that transition period was like.
Yeah, I mean, I really struggled because, I was, in that mindset of it was me, I was billing, I was, responsible for my own day to day. And then I had to be responsible for, numerous other people, what they were doing, what their targets were, and seeing that target increase massively from just you to having the responsibility of lots of others. So I found it personally very, very challenging. I think the thing for me is I was very much pushed into it. So it wasn't something that I'd thought about doing in terms of becoming a manager. I was just very much happy, billing and doing what I needed to do. But I was kind of pushed in the direction of, you need to be a manager, you need to, hire a team, grow a team, but still be billing the amount that you're billing.
So you were your archetypal big biller, and just because you were a big biller, you were forced into management, even though that wasn't something that you had on your agenda, on your horizon?
Yeah, because I was generating so much business that it wasn't sustainable for me to just do it. So the business, said, look, you're going to have to hire people. And then it kind of went from there. And yeah, it wasn't something that I personally wanted to do at the time. It was sold to me. And then obviously my mindset changed. I thought, okay, this could work, but.
And how did that make you feel? Because it sounds to me that you were pushed into that marketplace of management. How did that make you feel?
At the time, I sort of just went with it, because obviously I was, always chasing the money as big billers do, and thought, well, the more I bill and build, the more that I'll probably earn. But I'll be honest, that's just not the truth.
So it's an interesting call there, Paul, isn't it? When you start to think about that and start to think about what we were doing at sort of Adecco and places like that, bringing people through, but also when we got pulled through that process ourselves. How did you find that transition from being big biller into a manager?
Well, I think maybe I'm a bit different from Kelly, because I was, as you pointed out, it was prehistoric times when you and I were doing this sort of thing. But I wanted to be a manager. I know this will surprise people that know me. I was very controlling. I know that's a big surprise for anybody that knows me. And I wanted to manage people. It was something I wanted to do. I think for me, the transition, especially at those days, was partly fueled by ego, which is, you said it, Howard, and I don't doubt I felt the same way. I wanted to be a manager. It was important to me. But also, I was very keen to develop other people. It was something I still do. That's what we do. It's funny thinking back to my early 20s. Even then, I think I had a sort of passion, even though I wasn't aware of it, of teaching people. And that's, of course, what we do today. So it's always been something that's been a part of me. So I wanted to do it. I think the transition for me was difficult in the sense that I was a terrible delegator. And my view about my office now at that point, and I had, I think, probably 9, 10 people, was that in order for us to hit our monthly targets, quarterly, annual targets, the person that was most capable of achieving those numbers was me. And I felt I was the best sales guy in the office, the best closer, the best business developer, the best relationship manager, you name it. I consider myself better than anybody. So my very stupid attitude at that point was, well, because I'm better than everybody and because I'm under terrific pressure to achieve targets, my best bet here is to do it all. And it took an area manager to sit behind me, I remember, for a few days and just say to me, Paul, the target we've given you for your business is a collective target for the entire team, not for you on your own. I remember feeling kind of upset by it because I was working my heart out to try and get my business where it should have been. But of course, she was completely right. It took me some time to realize that delegation is a real skill and it's something that you have to do. And I'm talking about teaching. Of course, the only way ultimately people learn is to be delegated to give them chance to stretch, to be challenged, to take on new responsibilities. And that means letting go. It means teaching people, letting go, being prepared to trust. And we can perhaps talk about that in a minute. And gradually, I began to learn to delegate to a large degree. And surprise, surprise, if I go back to those ancient days at Alfred Marks Bureau, in 5 years, my office was the number one office out of 225 offices. That was because I learned to become a leader and not a manager. And that's something that took me some years to develop too.
It's interesting because I think I went through a similar sort of process that both you've gone through, and I felt I was on basically, I thought my transition was a full-on car crash. When I start to look back on it, and one thing that sort of motivated that time was that massive fear of failing. I was used to being so successful as a biller that when I started to experience failure as a manager, it took me some time to realize that it was actually, as you're saying there, Paul, it was actually me that was the problem. And I think stepping up from being a colleague to someone's manager, you started to talk about trust there. That trust element, I didn't quite understand. I thought they trusted me as they did before, but now that they're working for me, I'd gone from, I always classed it when I started to look back at it, I'd gone from mate to bait. And what I mean by that I was the person that they could pin all their failings on. So I was just being baited by them all the time. And what I didn't understand, that it was my lack of knowledge of them and my lack of knowledge of trust with them that was causing me to fail. And likewise, Paul, I wasn't delegating and I was taking everything on from there. So again, it's about working, I think, to gain their trust again as a manager is that biggest transition that you have to understand, is that they've gone from being your mates and they're no longer really your friends, because you're now managing them. And it's a very, very different relationship you have when you start to look at that. And I think what I start to understand is the power of that position. And so in my experience, I think that is the most powerful position in recruitment, but it's one that goes appallingly wrong. So yeah, when we start to look at that, Kelly, why do you think that sort of transition sometimes goes appallingly wrong?
For me personally, it was just the lack of support, the lack of training, the lack of structure around how it was going to work. If you're going to go from a big biller to a manager and you're there with lots of clients and vacancies and revenue potential, there needs to be a structure of how you're going to build a team around that. Do you bring in resources? Do you bring in 180s? Do you bring in 360 consultants? There's got to be a plan and a real structure. And for me personally, there was a massive lack of that in terms of how it's going to be done. Some fault of the businesses, but probably some fault of my own as well, because I was just, quite selfish and, the mindset wasn't there. And, some of the things that you guys have mentioned, struggling to delegate, realize, thinking that you're the best and, you take ownership of all the clients, people want to work with you. There's a lot that goes into it. But for me personally, it was just having that lack of, a definitive plan of how it would work. And I think for me also is, did I want it to work? When I look back now, I'm not really sure I wanted it to work.
That's an interesting comment, isn't it? You didn't want it to work. Is that because your heart was just set as a biller and you not as a manager?
Yeah, I think so. Yeah, because I was just so used to doing what I wanted to do and, managing clients and earning the revenue, and then just being set in a way of working that everything just changed. Your time changes, your day changes, your responsibility changes. We know that managing people is difficult. Hiring the right people is key, but that's a challenge as well. And I had some of them challenges in the sense of not hiring the right people. So, yeah.
It's interesting because I always felt that I felt out of control because I was in control of my billings, but I wasn't in control of their billings. Or at that point, that was my immediate thought, that I wasn't in control of their billings. So why do you think, Paul, that people fail at this transition?
Well, I think I hinted at this point earlier, and I know that people listening will understand what I'm about to say, because they'll have experienced this themselves, or they'll have seen it many times with other people. Very often what we tend to do in our industry is we promote our biggest billers to manage other people. And I know that people will agree with me on this point. Very often big billers exhibit the sort of behaviours you don't want to see in managers. So they will be very selfish, they'll be self-centered, avaricious, they can be duplicitous, all those lovely attributes that we see in people who are completely focused on making as much money for themselves and for the business as they can. They're not the attributes you want in great managers. In great managers, you want people that are selfless, prepared to help and support other people, give of themselves to others, not asking what's in it for them, great teachers, facilitators, nurturers, all those lovely attributes. And I'm afraid it's not often the case that those attributes are exhibited in the really hard-nosed top billers. Now, that's not to denigrate top billers, of course not, we love them. But what it does say, and I think Kelly's hinted at this, is that often the best solution for your biggest billers who exhibit that kind of behaviour is you don't give them people to manage, or if you do, one or two, because what will end up happening if you make them the leader or manager of several people is that it will go horribly wrong. People will consistently leave them, and they themselves will be miserable and will probably leave as well. So we tend to do that. And I know that everyone listening will have seen it and have heard it and may even be one of those people themselves. You've got to, when you're looking at who you develop into managers and leaders, really consider the behaviors and values of those people, perhaps on a higher level than their ability to make placements. Because what you're doing, even as a billing manager, is you're asking them to nurture and develop people around them, to teach people to be as good as they are. So if they lack those natural attributes, no matter how hard you try, they're not going to be comfortable in leading bigger teams. Now you can give them one or two people, and that's probably okay. So interestingly, and this is often seen elsewhere outside of our industry, we talk about great football managers, for example, and you look back in, if anyone's interested in football, the wonderful footballers in the past, the Bobby Moores and the Bobby Charltons, they weren't particularly good managers, but they were outstanding international world-class footballers. So you can see examples elsewhere. So there are different skill sets. What we look for in leaders are not always the natural attributes of the big billers. And I am generalizing, so just to be clear on that point, but I know that people will be listening to me on that point. So where it goes wrong very often is that as an industry, we're not assessing people against the behaviors and values of the job description correctly. What we're doing is we're rewarding our best billers by giving them promotions and extra salaries and more responsibilities, which will often backfire.
So I think there's lots of reasons why it goes wrong, and training we're going to cover certainly later on, but I think what Kelly hit there on the lack of support from above and the lack of understanding of what that transition is going to look like, that's the bit where I think it goes wrong. I mean, I was a huge biller, and I think my management believed that I could do both, and I certainly believed that I could do both, that impacting on my own performance. But what it actually did was impact on both my billing performance and my management performance, mainly because I lack the knowledge, I lack the skills, but I lack the support, which should have been there to make that transition much easier. And I think what a lot of people don't underestimate is how much work that transition actually takes to move from billing to managing, and understanding that if you actually get it right, then the actual overall billings hugely increase, where if you get it wrong, then billings go down on both sides, because as the main biller, you're trying to catch yourself up and you can't do that. And what you're doing is then annoying all your other billers, and you start to lose people, and you start to create attrition problems. So I think it's really important that when you make that transition, we start to look at what we're going to be given. So if we looked at your transition, Kelly, what training were you given either pre the move or during the move or well after the move? What training were you given that would help you, or should have helped you actually make that transition smoother?
I was pretty much just given some armbands and told how to learn to swim again. That's what I was given. For me, not a lot really, to be honest. It was very much, okay, let's hire one person, you train them, did that, worked really well, right, hire another one, you train them to do your market, to do what you do and follow in your footsteps, do it again, do it again, do it again, do it again. But I wasn't given the tools or the guidance of how I should be doing that. I kind of just ran with it and went with what I knew and what I'd learned, and tried to offload that to the people that I was hiring. So it was literally just a case of winging it, really. And that's where, again, I think it fails is, obviously in the past when I was at Rulian, I'd done Institute of Leadership and Management, I've done a recruitment qualification, but none of that teaches you how to be a manager. None of that teaches you how to go through a transition of, just fending for yourself and being a successful biller, to then hiring new people, training them, whilst continuing to do the billing side of things. So yeah, I think it's something that many businesses probably fail at in terms of how they're going to develop the billers into managers.
And how did that make you feel as a superstar in the business, a big biller in the business? You're then being pushed into a position that maybe in your heart of hearts you didn't want, but then having zero support and zero training. How did that make you feel towards the business?
Resent. I just, every day I was just feeling like I was being chipped away. And, I got to the point where I just wasn't enjoying my job anymore. It affected me personally. It's not what I'd signed up for. It's not what I wanted. And that's what, got to the point where I ended up leaving. And you said it earlier, Paul, people leave for them reasons. And that was what I did. And I decided to go and, take everything away and just go and focus on what I'm really, really good at, which is, building relationships, maintaining relationships and billing. And now I do that for myself. And it's put me off management completely.
So it's an interesting case, isn't it? So we see this happen quite a lot, that you've been heralded as a huge biller, round peg into a square hole, which we know doesn't work. And then they lose both a really good biller, but obviously what they've lost the opportunity besides your billings, but the other people in the business that may have fallen out of the process from there. When you look at that, Paul, what sort of training were you given as you made that transition? Because you talked about, you were very much under the same focus as Kelly and I. Yeah. I'm going to do it myself. If the team aren't going to bill it, I'm going to bill it.
Yeah, right. Well, firstly, I just want to add on something that Kelly just said. What a shame, because the company lost an amazingly valuable member of the team, a business she probably didn't want to leave initially, and look at what the others lost as well, an outstanding colleague who they could have learned a lot from. So, there's an awful lot to learn from Kelly's story. In terms of training I've received, as I recall, nothing, not unlike you guys. I like the water wings analogy because that's how it felt to me. I was thrown in the deep end, and I think I just about managed to keep my head above the water on the third time of going under. I do remember very, very vividly, even all these years later, thinking it's just a matter of days before someone rocks up and sacks me, because I just didn't know what I was doing. I had no idea. It was a question of trying to follow my instincts, try to do the right thing with virtually no experience of managing others in a recruitment business. And all I knew was what I knew, which was how to be a good consultant. So my first 12 months was a total struggle. And to this day, I know I only got through it by my own bloody mindedness and resilience. It certainly wasn't anything to do with any training or support I received from anybody. And if anything, all I was learning really was not how not to do it, by watching others around me in other offices who were equally manic as I was. So, I think this point here is very valid. When we develop people, we promote people. The idea, of course, is not to put people into a position where they're guaranteed to fail. The idea is to help them, guide them, support them before they become managers. And then when they become managers, make sure that you place a support system around them, not only in terms of coaching and training, but people they can talk to, peer group, their bosses, others in the organization who are there for them. Because it is a big transition moving from managing a desk, and in this case, this conversation, continuing to manage a desk and also learn to manage and develop other people. And as you said at the top of this discussion, the hardest job in the world. Maybe not, but it's certainly extremely difficult. So my recollection in those early days was I got there through my own just resilience and just never give up attitude. But I would have been, I think if I think back, the level of attrition in Alfred Marks Bureau at that time was massive. And it was predominantly because people were not being trained. And it was, if you survived, it was through your own sheer graft. Really. So my experience wasn't great, and I'd experienced that again and again when I was promoted over the years. Just get in, do your job, and fingers crossed, hopefully you'll be all right. And we know now that is clearly not the way to develop people.
So I think, we're saying the same story, because I think I had very little training beforehand, and it was only when I went on my first true management training course about 18 months after being promoted into the job that I could actually understand that I was the issue. I was the problem. It wasn't anybody else. It was me that was the problem. And like you, Paul, I wanted to manage and I wanted to learn, but I felt that I wasn't learning anything. And in that course, they gave me a book and said, here, read this book. And it was like, all of a sudden I started to read the book and I started to understand some of the things that I was doing wrong that I could start to change. And that just led me on a course of self-development. And I just then started to devour management books, reading them, taking little bits out of each, etc. I was pushing back constantly, but kept self-educating and absorbing things. And, what I found was that all of these books, the foundations of management, were almost identical in each book. It was all about people first, coaching them, making them powerful within their own rights, getting the people to trust you, and helping them to develop their strengths and manage their weaknesses. And once I understood that, that actually started to sort of drive me to empower others to achieve better results. But it was only, like you say, that Paul, there through my own bloody-mindedness and my own thirst for knowledge, that I actually did that. But you could look at Kelly's side from the other side, where that switched it completely off and didn't want to drive that thirst for knowledge. So it's important that when we start to think about promoting people into these positions, what are we going to support them? How are we going to support them? How are we going to help educate them? Because it's a huge educational piece from being that self-sufficient, self-absorbed big biller into being a caring manager that's developing people. And I think that's when we've got to start to look at it. So when we start to look and we sort of made the transition, let's talk about you, because I think we're going to have a slightly different view here. I think we get a view that's very similar to its point of view, but I think we're going to get views that are quite different as well. When you made the transition, did you focus more on your own billings, or did you focus more on getting your team up to speed?
So initially it was own billings, purely because that's what I was so used to. And then I obviously realized that I needed to start putting the time into, developing the team, training people. So I kind of then split my time. Obviously, I was still very heavily focused on my own billings, because you take your foot off that, then your earnings don't, are not the same. So that for me led to me working extra hours. So I found myself getting in the office 2 hours before my team to do some of my own work in terms of resourcing and stuff like that. Then managing my day around the team, training, meetings, or being out on the road. And then towards the end of the day, taking my work home in the evenings and then doing my own billings then, which then for me led to working sometimes 15, 16-hour days, which then led to a burnout.
Yeah.
So you can see why that happens, because obviously you're so absorbed in your own billings, and therefore the only way that you can do that is extend your day. And you say, starting at ridiculous o'clock in the morning, working till ridiculous o'clock at night is no good for anyone. Paul, what did you, you've already mentioned that your first thought process was, I can build this myself.
Yeah.
Talk to me what happened.
Well, I'm same as Kelly. I mean, I just got in earlier and earlier and worked later and later. And of course, in my day, or our day, Howard, we didn't have mobile phones. We barely had, in fact, I didn't even have word processors or computers. It was still analog. And I have to say that we, in some respects, it was a lot more fun. But overall, I couldn't work from home, obviously. So the only way I could work harder. Can you hear that?
Yeah.
Sorry, you can hear music?
No, can't hear music.
Oh, I've lost you. Can you?
I think Paul's got.
Can you hear me, guys?
We can hear you, Paul. Can you? We can hear you. We can't hear any music, so you're quite fine.
Carry on.
Yeah, I'll carry on, because I think Paul's having a bit of technical problems with his earphones. I think what Paul was saying that is a very similar thing to me. That my failing was that I wanted to, like you, Kelly. I just thought I could bill and carry on billing it, and it was me. My team was failing, so I was failing. So, I just sort of absolutely driven. And I remember sort of sit there, and I remember reading one section of a book, and it wasn't sort of long after this. And, it's an age-old African proverb and used by lots of people nowadays was, if you want to go fast, go alone. But if you want to go far, go together. And I suddenly realized then is that I cannot carry on billing and carrying everything on my shoulders. I had to start to spread the load. And once I started to spread the load and started to delegate things out to other people, then I started to see a huge change in the team. But it took, myself to the brink of working all hours God sends to do that. And it took somebody else to point out to me, if you want to go further, you have to go as a team rather going it alone. And I think that was a real big difference to me and a big change to me from there. So,
Howard, I'm back in the game again. Sorry, apologies for my technical issues. Just to finish my point, just to finish that off. I mean, I was getting in earlier and working later and later, and to Kelly's point, getting myself into quite a frazzle because, as I said earlier, and Kelly made this point too, my mindset was the quickest way to get the billings achieved was just for me to throw myself in harder and harder and harder. And of course, in doing that, what you're doing is you're exhibiting old behavior. You're not changing your style. You're not working with others. You're a little island in the middle of an office, unapproachable, not listening to people around you, not aware of what's happening to your colleagues, and completely unaware, I might add, of strategic issues that might impact your business. So, that was certainly my experience. I just worked harder and harder and harder and harder. And for me, getting quite stressed because the targets were getting further and further away from me.
So I think then on reflection, we're all saying a very similar story, and I've got a very similar story to tell. So if we looked at that, what would aid transition to make it more successful for all concerned? So if you had to go through that transition again, Kelly, and you wanted to be a manager, because I think that's a very big question, okay, what would aid that transition for you to make it more successful?
Just by having a better structure in place of how it's going to work. So going back to my point before of having no structure. So if I was to look back at what I would do differently is basically everything. I would, understand what it is that I wanted to do, what it is that I wanted to achieve, and how the structure of that team would work. I think I would also, for me, obviously, I was still targeted quite substantially in terms of the revenue that I was required to bring in. I think, if anyone's going to become a manager, you have to look at their personal targets and their personal billings and not give them such a high expectation. I'd probably learn to delegate better, probably learn to not be as much as a control freak, and just change the mindset of, actually people can do this and it's not just me. But I also think that, training people in the right way has to be done, training them into management. I just don't believe that you can just throw someone into it without giving them full training and support. I think every recruitment business is set up very, very differently. So for me, my situation is very different than anyone that's listening here or been in a very similar situation. I was responsible for everything in terms of sales, business development, training the new staff, etc. Some businesses have business development managers or people that do the training for them. So I think my situation is quite unique. But for me, I would probably just have a better structure and better support network in order to get me onto that management.
It's interesting, isn't it? But I think we're all going to come across a similar sort of thread to this. So Paul, give me what you think would have aided your transition into that.
Well, it's a bit, when you think back how staccato it is. 1 minute you're doing one job, you go home Friday evening, Monday you're doing a brand new job. No prep in advance. Suddenly, there you go, here's your opportunity, and off you jolly well trot. And of course, we said ego earlier. Somewhere in your mind, you're thinking, well, I'm going to be brilliant at this. Why would you come up with that emotion? You've got no experience. You've received precious little development or training. You're literally being set up to fail. And so I think that what you've got to be doing when you're developing people to move into that next level is put in the groundwork in advance. You've got to, it's like studying for an exam, isn't it? You don't just turn up on exam day and hope to goodness somehow by complete fluke you're going to pass the exam. You've put in a lot of time in studying and doing everything in advance so that when you turn up, you've got a great chance of passing the exam. Now, promotion in a sense is not dissimilar. The prep has to be done beforehand. What we tend to do is we get people into positions and then we try and train them. And it's almost at the point, as Kelly stated, that we're trying to prevent them from drowning. And we're surprised they're struggling when actually the development and training should have been given to them. So the transition, before they got promoted, the transition is relatively straightforward. So, I think this comes down to looking at within every organization, L&D, that lovely expression. I believe now most, if not all organizations are acutely aware of how important it is. We also know, don't we, that people stay in organizations where they genuinely believe they're being developed. We're recruiters. When we interview people that are changing jobs, we often find that one of the big reasons they leave work is because they feel overlooked, they're not being developed, not being trained, they don't feel that their careers are going anywhere. Well, we have had a habit of doing that in our own industry. So you've got to be looking at developing people, not just at the point at which they get the promotion, but giving them the opportunity to move into that next level when they're truly ready, or in fact, having received the coaching, have realized it's not for them. And that's fine, by the way, because not everybody wants to be or necessarily should be a manager or a leader. Nothing wrong with that. There's space for everybody in recruitment.
Interesting, isn't it? Because I've said exactly the same. Training, mentoring, and then I'll repeat again. Training and mentoring is what we did. And I've just done a course with a company up in the northwest, where we had around about 8 or 9 people on the course, of which 3 dropped out because they realised management wasn't for them. But what's that's done, it's saved those 3 people in the business not to be put through a situation that Kelly got put through, and they're now happy billing, happy driving their billings, and they've got 5 really good people that are stepping up into management. And I think what you're saying there, Paul, is exactly what I said. That training before you move people into the role is so important. It's the most important role in the business. So really the business should invest in outside training, and that's not a plug for us. Okay, it is a plug for us, but it's not meant to be a plug for us. But you need to give the person the tool set to succeed. You need to empower them to make mistakes and get them a coach, a mentor to help them bridge the gap. I remember going through this. I felt alone. I felt marooned. But once my performance as a manager started to change, guess what? My senior management started to change their views of me again. And, they started to want to know me again. But I'd feel like I'd been abandoned, where I was flavour of the month, and now I wasn't. And that was a real big catalyst to me. And it was a big catalyst for me to move. And it took me 3 years before I actually did move and found the company that I wanted to move for. But that lack of training, that lack of sport, that disengagement from my seniors, was a really big sort of knife in my back, and one of the reasons why I looked to leave. However, once I understood what I was doing, it brought me closer to my team. And I felt hugely sad and conflicted when I left, because I was desperate to leave the senior management, but I didn't want to leave my team. And I think what we've got to start to think about is the reason people leave is because, what, as Paul said, that it's about the development and they're not getting. So if you start to identify people who have got really good potential in management, irrespective of their billings, we should be training, we should be developing them, we should be putting them through these type of courses, irrespective of whether they want to go through to that position or not, because you're giving them a choice, but you're also helping them further their development and giving them choices, where before what we're doing is just saying, get promoted and this is your promotion criteria, this is your promotion ladder, this is where you're going, rather than actually having a choice of where they want to go. So that leads me to the final question for today. If you could give one piece of advice for either a company or someone about to make that move, what would it be?
If it's a company, it would be to make sure that it's the right person that you're putting into that move. I don't believe that all the best salespeople are good managers. Going back to Paul's comment earlier, the best footballers weren't the best managers, and it's the same for top billers. Not every top biller is going to be a great manager. If it's for an individual who is a top biller, my advice would be to ensure it's really what you want and be aware of the changes that it will encounter. There are changes in terms of your job role, in terms of your financials, in terms of your billings and your comms. So just making sure that it's the right move for them, and from a business perspective, making sure it's the right individual, because putting the wrong individual into that position will cost a lot more money in the long term.
I think it's an interesting point. Good. Jump in there, Paul.
Yeah, I was going to say Kelly's completely right. Look, firstly, I will say this, and I know Kelly's view is different from mine. That's fine. I've always loved managing and leading. It's something I've loved doing, and I would encourage anybody that wants to develop their career to forge that particular path. But as Kelly rightly says, it's not for everybody, and people should be making their own choices. A lot of the answers to this question come about by making sure that you have robust methods in your business if you're promoting internally, through performance reviews and all of the things that should be done to establish what people's ambitions are and what their drivers are. And we should be very aware of each individual's personal training needs and their ambitions, their strengths and their gaps before we give them the opportunities. We do often thrust people into those senior roles out of necessity sometimes because of the urgency. And I'm also, it sounds an odd thing to say at this point, given what we've already said, but given the high growth in lots of businesses at the moment, sometimes people are given these opportunities perhaps a little bit quicker than normally you would like to give it to them. But at least at that point, make sure that they are capable of succeeding, not failing. And I think that from an individual's perspective, it's a career choice. Make that career choice carefully. Think hard about it. Think about how it's going to impact you. Kelly makes a point. It may impact you in the short term from a financial point of view. It's not unusual for people that are high billers to move into that management role to see a decrease in the short term in their earnings. People that have done that, and I've been in that position several times, I wasn't thrilled about it, but I was happy because I knew I was on a path I wanted to travel, and I knew in due course I would do better as a leader, as a manager financially than staying running a desk. That was my choice. So let's be making sure that people are very aware of exactly what's in store for them, that when they get the opportunity, they feel fully supported and trained, and they've got a great fighting chance of making the grade. But we don't pull away from them the moment we give them the opportunity. We continue to support, as you said earlier, Howard, and mentor those people, because they are incredibly valuable, and you do not want to lose the Kelly Nolans of this world from your business. That's for sure.
I think that's the closing comment from all three of us, is that choose the right person. And I think that spotting potential early is really important. Then educating, training, coaching and mentoring them before you promote them is really important. If you think, everyone trains before a big event, the big event is the movement into that job. So we should be doing that. If you want to be seen as a natural successor, you should be seen as that natural successor before you get promoted into the job. And therefore, to me, it's not just all about billings. There's lots of other things that a manager has to portray as a skill set that we should be highlighting and looking out for. And then we should be looking at how we can develop those type of things. And if we can develop those type of things, then all of a sudden you've got a very, very strong team. And what you're saying, Paul, is absolutely right. Promoting your biggest biller into a position such as happened to Kelly, what you end up doing is alienating a big biller, but what damage has that process done to the rest of the team and curtailed their billings as well? And that is a massive opportunity lost, and it's a massive potential problem with lots of recruitment agencies out there. So to me, that piece of advice is find the right person and train and develop them before they make the move is absolutely the thing that I would do. So next week, Kelly, first of all, let's thank Kelly for her time today.
Thanks, Kelly.
I think it's
Thank you for having me.
Absolute pleasure. I think it's really interesting listening to your view, because you're that person that didn't want to be a manager, being pushed into it. And it's really interesting hearing what you're saying, and then compared to two people that wanted to be a manager, but the same things applied, but just in a different viewpoint. So it's an interesting sort of review of what happened. Next week, though, we're going to look at something slightly different. What happens if you put someone into a management role and it's not working? How can we sort of retain that? How can we change that? How can we work that? And I think it's important that we start to address that problem before we look at the final webinar of this series of 4, when we're going to look at billing manager versus P&L manager, which will be a really interesting debate of moving people away from having a target. As Kelly said, I'm carrying a big target. I carried a huge target as well as my team target, as did Paul, or do you just go to a team environment, etc. So the next 2 sessions are going to be really interesting sessions. So thanks very much for your time, everybody. Kelly, once again, thank you for your time. Ladies and gents, we look forward to seeing you all next week again for another recruitment discussion. But next week is all about how do we work with failing managers. Ladies and gents, thanks
Thank
for your
you,
time.
everybody.
See you next week.
Thank you, everybody.
Cheers, Paul. Cheers,
Thank
Kelly.
you. See
Bye.
you guys.